I'm Rick Sanchez. Did you know that nearly 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans in southern states still inhabited a starkly unequal world of disenfranchisement, segregation, and various forms of oppression, including race-inspired violence? In the turbulent decade and a half that followed, civil rights activists used nonviolent protests and civil disobedience to try and bring about change. And the federal government made legislative headway with actions such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Many leaders from within the African American community and beyond rose to prominence during the civil rights era, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, Andrew Goodman, and many, many others. They risked and sometimes lost their lives in the name of freedom and equality. To learn more from the civil rights movement and its impacts, we've decided to invite members of our community who've experienced this particular era. Our own James Pierre sat down with Dr. Maikel professor at Miami-Dade College, and Keith Hartgrove, former MDC student.
Thank you all for joining us. Let me start with you, Dr. Maikel. You were involved in the Washington, D.C.-based support network and working group from 1962 to 1969, based at Georgetown University. So you have seen and lived during the segregation time where African Americans did not have the right to vote, to be in certain classroom, theater. So what do you recall from those moments?
Well, it's interesting. In my class, Georgetown, that started in '61, had the first African American members in the School of Foreign Service class. But within the school itself, because of my background in gang conflict resolution in Chicago, that brought me into context with many people very different than myself. When I got to Georgetown, I realized that some very important things were happening in the community, which, although it was the nation's capital, it was the nation's last colony without voting representation in Congress. But I also became aware of the fact that there were many people who had the right to vote that were disenfranchised because of local histories based on discrimination, based on color, and so on, through some very socially disturbing and socially enlightening members of the clergy, as well as the faculty community and some of my fellow students who came from very different places. No one else that year was from Chicago in my background, and Chicago was also very much subdivided into different regions. So, as luck would have it, my dormitory advisor was an advisor to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Richard McSorley, a Jesuit priest who had lived through the Bataan Death March and was very much nonviolent and very much adulated and worked closely with Dr. King and Mr. Abernathy and the other wonderful people who were attempting to set up a network which back in Washington was useful because as they were on the front lines of challenging the various dishonesties by local governments, disenfranchising voters, they wanted to make sure that someone in the center of this apparent democracy was causing awareness, at least bringing to public attention what wasn't going right, also what was going right, and then trying to federalize a problem that everyone wanted to be a states' right issue.
Obviously, politics played a big role during that time, but you also mentioned religion, Catholic Church. What was the role of the Catholic Church during that time, from your perspective?
From my perspective, from within that setting, while Richard McSorley identified as a Jesuit priest, I would identify Brady Tyson as a Methodist over at American U. I would identify Jeremiah Kelleher, African-American Methodist Episcopalian, the AME group, and of course then the wonderful contributions of the leadership out of the Baptist and other traditions. So from my kind of novice perception, this was the John the 23rd in my tradition, I happen to be Catholic, social justice. On the other hand, my perception was, look what institutions are moving so slowly. The U.S. Catholic Conference, the National Council of Churches jerkily, if not very slowly, and some of these other instruments. So I basically became aware through my kind of spiritual, religious dimensions, very much aware that those institutions weren't completed or weren't socially just, even in reference to their own terms, while the country was suffering from a bigger problem as well.
Wow, wow. Keith, joining us as well. Thank you so much. You're a former MDC student.
Yes.
Now you're pursuing your master's degree. Thank you as well for joining us. Like I said, your dad experienced firsthand history in the 40s. Give us a background of your dad, who he was.
Well, my father was a Tuskegee Airman. He came out of the first class. My father experienced a great deal of racism and separatism, and didn't really talk about it too much at home. I knew about my father being a Tuskegee Airman, but my father wanted to be known as an American, not as a black American, not as an African American, but an American, because he fought for this country and he fought for his rights.
Interesting you say that he did not talk about it as much as you recall, but why so? Was it a way to preserve you, or preserve the family, take family out of work?
I would have to say that I believe that my father didn't speak about it because for him it was a time of real turmoil, and in some ways he was ashamed that he had to raise his children, having gone through that and having them still to have the residual effects of racism on their lives. And I had issues in my own life. I had teachers that said some very nasty, terrible things to me that even to this day I remember. In the 5th grade, I had a teacher, her name was Mrs. Sullivan, and she told me that I was a little black boy, and I was, if I were to be able to sweep the streets of Boston after getting out of school, that I would be lucky to be able to sweep the streets of Boston.
How was the conversation at home with your dad or the whole family? Did you guys talk about race? Did you guys talk about religion at home?
We talked about religion very much, but we also talked about education. And my father and my mother both really believed that education was a way around the obstacles that were set before me just because of my black face.
Wow, interesting. Dr. Maikel, how was it at home for you? I mean, your parents are Irish, even though you do not consider yourself a white man. How was conversation at home about race?
Well, it's interesting. I just discovered an affinity that Keith and I have. My father, who was killed, shot down 6 months after I was born in the Air Force in the lower Philippines, only contributed obliquely, in fact, from going through their correspondence, actually more as an adult than as a young person. And the one area where he mentioned the Tuskegee brothers and so on, and because while he was a navigator, too big to be a pilot, and he didn't volunteer, he was conscripted, but in the Air Force, that special appreciation. So back at home, a single head of household, my mother basically, again, kind of taught me from the inside looking out, you are a part of whoever you're with. And I always remember that because getting drawn into some of the local conflict between the Cobras, which was a fairly significant gang in Chicago, located at Dunbar, I would say at that time, a predominantly black institution, and me being over at Oak Park River Forest, where we had one black student, Julian, Tom Julian, son of fairly well-known scientist, but out of 3,500 public school students, only one African American. So you get a picture of differences.
What did that tell you at that time?
And of course, a part of what it told me was somewhat the point Keith was making, and that is, education seems to work for anybody, but in a narrow, prejudiced way, saying there's got to be more than one black person whose father is at the University of Chicago and who happens to be living in the neighborhood. And then through the Red Cross, which got me into kind of a mediation role with some of my own neighbors in Chicago, Mexican American and Black American. We had about 4 interesting gangs, and Red Cross was a negotiating tool. And so my first experiences in front of 3,000 people who didn't look at all like me at Dunbar, or at Nuestra Guadalupana, a local school, who didn't sound at all like me, and so on, began to make me realize, but the common things at that time through Red Cross and service and so on, made us a lot more the same in the community. And until really the university level, I had no experience really learning together with people from different racial or other ethnic backgrounds.
Wonderful. You mentioned education, and this is one of the key elements as well in the civil rights movement. In 1960, Ruby Bridges, a 6-year-old girl, became the first African-American child to desegregate an all-white elementary school in the South. We're talking about New Orleans, right? Surrounded by a team of U.S. Marshals, she was met by a vicious mob shouting and throwing objects at her. So it was a very, very tough time for her. What is your take on that? What was your first day at school? What was it for you, kid?
Well, Massachusetts has always been a pretty progressive state, and although there were some issues with being in school, where I went to school in Boston, it didn't get really overly overt for me until I got into high school. At the high school level, it got pretty bad. I went to a high school in Hyde Park, a part of Boston, and they had snipers on the rooftops, and we had to go through that kind of segregation and hatred, but were kind of like, we had numbers, and there is strength in numbers. The strength that I had was my friends being with me and surrounding me, and we always made sure that we never left or went to school alone. So that was kind of a belonging. That may not have been so for a lot of people, but in my circumstance, that's what I had, was I had my friends and my family that were there to support what I was trying to do, which was get an education.
Was it the same picture, Dr. Maikel, at Georgetown?
Not really within the school itself, because there were so few African Americans. Lou Brown, the only member of my class, which was the first in the School of Foreign Service to include an African American, but Lou became the trigger for opening up a lot of things I didn't see before I got to Georgetown in terms of a social sense, and then with regard to eventually meeting people who didn't always agree with Dr. King in the Student Nonviolent and Coordinating Committee, the tallest person I think I've ever met, Stokely Carmichael, and some of these other individuals who really disturbed me in retrospectively in an important way. But at the time realizing, whoa, life is not what it seems. And then thinking back to that school entry, which I saw on black and white TV in Chicago. But don't forget, in Chicago, Oak Park, Cicero, Berwyn, there were race riots with the entry of students of color and so on in those very close suburbs to where I lived. And I could not believe, the implications of an otherwise, from the ground looking up, seemingly functional society. So to get back to your point, basically I would call Lou as kind of a journeyman, or I guess today we'd say navigator, in terms of this is you, this is the rest of society. What are you, going to come out of your cocoon and become a part of? And so that's why it was kind of a early part of a transformative effect, but to someone not really on a day-to-day basis, having the privilege nor the pleasure of actually living, working, disagreeing, and getting along with African Americans.
How many Black or African Americans were inside of your classroom during that time, Keith?
For me at the William Lloyd Garrison elementary school, most of the kids in my class were either Jewish or Black, and I remember it so well because we always had a very small classroom on the Jewish holidays. Those are the days when we conducted classes a little different. We missed some things during those days because the Jewish kids weren't there. So they give us things to do to just occupy our minds and occupy our time rather than to really try to teach us on those days because they didn't want to have to do things twice.
Wow. Interesting, to have different point of view from different time.
Absolutely.
And what's going on. We have to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about the Alabama governor, George Wallace, and also Selma. Very interesting conversation. Stay with us.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain.
February is Black History Month. Join us here at Miami-Dade College as we pay tribute to those leaders, their achievements, and perseverance to fight for equality for all. Individuals like civil rights leader Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., educator Booker T. Washington, anti-slavery activist Frederick Douglass, abolitionist and women's rights activist Sojourner Truth, abolitionist Harriet Tubman, activist Rosa Parks, the first African-American Secretary of State, General Colin Powell, the first African-American female Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, and our first African-American U.S. President, Barack Obama, are all celebrated for their successes, thus becoming a role model to all. Miami-Dade College is proud to celebrate Black History Month by recognizing these and many other individuals for their accomplishments in our nation's history.
In 1963, Dr. King made his historic speech, "I Have a Dream." 2 years later, he led a peaceful march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. Thousands of African Americans, whites, and citizens from other ethnicities walked with him. It was for one goal, the right to vote for African Americans. James Pierre continues his conversation with Dr. Maikel Lanigan and Selena Respas.
And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
The Alabama governor, George Wallace, standing against desegregation while being confronted by federal authorities at the University of Alabama. He stated, "No way we will allow African Americans to attend University of Alabama." It was a very long fight for education, wasn't it, Dr. Maikel?
Well, it really was because of his complete disobedience to the ruling of the Supreme Court, by his complete disobedience with regard to the rights of individuals. It's supposed to be rooted in the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. But it was also an electric moment because of media, which basically communicated what that governor said to people, particularly college students and others across the country, that basically said, this is happening right now, right here in this country, and it was absolutely unimaginable. Now, in all honesty, there were those who did not agree with the government's position, the federal government's position. And so the stirring of a nascent pot of discrimination, of mutual distrust, of many other things also occurred as a result of that. And so I am sure, well, I'm not sure, but I don't believe the unintended consequence, creating a national consciousness, another dimension of national consciousness on the inequality advanced by states' rights. I don't think that was his intention. And on the other hand, I'm glad he did what he did, because it was a lightning bolt to many people across the country, including those of us located in Washington, D.C., but even family members of mine in Chicago and others who just basically said, you know, there's further evidence that you may be right about what's wrong in parts of this country.
Talking about Washington, D.C., the president himself, President Kennedy, had to intervene during that moment. What is your take on that, Selena, joining us now?
If you're talking about the president intervening, I thought it was like very crucial, because he was right in the middle of a civil rights war that the country wasn't prepared for. As his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, he was interested in the poverty that both blacks and whites had experienced. And so with the president stepping forward, saying, like, Alabama, you will obey this declaration in regards to allowing this young black girl or young man to enter schools within your state, it will happen. And if not, we are prepared to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And but still, it was more a political decision, would you say, for Judge Wallace, because he wants to stay in the conservative side? That was that?
It was a political decision because many people forget that the governorships in the southern states were all Democrats. They were Southern Democrats. People kind of forget because of the outcome of the dynamics that was provoked by Governor Wallace and some of the evil represented in even some of the community-based movements from the Ku Klux Klan and others to preserve those apparent so-called states' rights in a country that was a federal democratic republic in which the national commitments were supposed to trump or basically overshadow different discrepancies that violated basic civil rights. So Selena is totally correct when she says that in essence the clash was set up. It created as much pressure in Washington, I believe, as it did in Alabama and across the country, because there was a great hesitancy among a leader whose party was the dominant party in Congress to get the Southern subdominant group to buy off on the plan. And I think you used an excellent word in describing that with regard to a national crisis that was unprepared for. On the other hand, as frail as democratic institutions are sometimes when they're enlivened, enlightened, and enraged by people who know how to use it in a nonviolent way, ultimately even the tactics of creating change, not the gun culture and the hose culture and the dog culture, but the creative nonviolence culture and practicing the principles of religious beliefs and ethics that you believe would cause another type of confrontation that would really tweak the soul of the country.
Yeah, absolutely. 2 years later, after Governor Wallace's action, we're going to see the big march, what we call in 1965, the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, led by Dr. King, an historical and peaceful march. Your take on that, Selena?
Well, since I wasn't there, I should say that I was at home with my parents, watching all this activity happen on television, and watching those people, black, white, blue, green, brown, coming from all over the country to march to make a statement about people who should be empowered and not discriminated against was overwhelming. I could only equate that like when President Kennedy was assassinated. I mean, the impact that it had. In regards to watching this on TV, not going to school, but watching that march of Selma going to Montgomery, it was overwhelming. Young people my age at that time were marching, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old children were marching alongside of adults, making a statement about we deserve equality. And so I would just say, like, it was just like overwhelming. And then I understood what my responsibility was. If I said, if those young people are marching, then I know exactly what I must do. And I was in a different state and didn't experience what they had experienced, but I'm sure I was there on the fringe.
Yeah. All right. Dr. Maikel, I'm pretty sure you lived that experience as well, but you did something very amazing. You took 28 students, Miami-Dade College students, to Selma to experience that moment. Tell me more about that.
Well, again, I'm not a historian, but 1965, the March on Selma, and don't forget there were two precedent initiatives, one which led to national attention that was unsuccessful in the eyes of the marchers under Dr. King, a second which sought a court intervention for which Dr. King was repudiated. Well, but he was repudiated by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and some others, and Malcolm X himself, for not pushing instead of waiting for a court order. And then when he went with the court order, with all the protections, which was the successful march that you described across that previous bridge and so on, I think we think historically, wow, that was the breakthrough to the Capitol. That was the breakthrough in terms of voting. Finally, the 1965 Civil Rights Act. Fast forward, 2013, 28 students from Miami-Dade College, 5 campuses, through the Alternative Breaks program of the Institute for Civic Engagement and Democracy, facilitated by Josh Young and Harold Silva at the school, had arranged for those who wanted to volunteer to go to Selma for a week in May. Guests of the Freedom Foundation and many, but not all, members of the Selma community to have a week to engage, to participate. First we thought we'd have difficulty, and then suddenly there was 28, and I didn't have to drive, and we got a bus, and it was whatever. But arriving there and sleeping in the basement of a Unitarian church there, kind of almost like in the spirit of the earlier movements, and becoming involved there, the most poignant observation, experience, witness was things haven't changed much. And it's 50 years later.
50 years later, it was pretty much the same picture that we had in
most churches and any community of its size and so on, but often because there were 2 churches for everybody, predominantly black and predominantly white, with 2 exceptions. There was 2 of everything, still not entirely segregated, in all fairness to many of the people who have tried to realize the dreams there, but very slow, incrementally painful, and disgracefully inclusive, even at this particular, the 2013 May. And so it was very interesting. And so a number of the students, we worked in some high schools and some other places. It was only a week. But just the notion, as you got up early and walked in things, you with that group? And of course I'm saying, you mean my family? You got that many kids? I said, my extended family. But 28 very diverse-looking, wonderful students, and my colleague, Dr. Medina. And so these were educable moments, but they also were consciousness-raising, realizing things are not finished in that actual, crucible in which so much went forward, but it wasn't a backdraft from that fire. There's a long way to go. Yeah.
Wow. Interesting to hear that, Selena. When you heard that, powerful statement from Dr. Maikel, I will say, from Selma, 50 years later, we still have a long way to go. As an African American, what is that telling you?
That tells me that we still have a long way to go. And we have to prepare our students on a global perspective to understand that what happened 50 years ago, it's still alive and well today, and that we must address it, or they must address it, in means, be it through social media, be it through being engaged in going on trips to areas that are historically known for practicing segregation, having them understand the laws, civic engagement, what does that mean? But most of all, I think that having them understand that we are all different. But if we cut one another, I can believe that the blood will be red. It won't be purple or orange. It'll be the same. It might be a different blood type, but it will still be red. And we have just like instill in our students that the diversity, that the struggle still continues as relates to everyone within our society having equal rights. Because we haven't mentioned this, but the civil rights movement was the foundation for a lot of other things that are happening within society, such as people with disabilities, issues dealing with the elderly, immigration. I mean, all of those things were key. And to think that Dr. King and others pushed the envelope, but it was a struggle, and we're still struggling and trying to figure out a better way to make all of those dreams that he talked about during that Washington march come true. We're still struggling, trying to do that. And then we're still struggling with how can we perfect it to a point where there are no loopholes in it, where it just is clear and smooth.
On the third segment, you won't be on the set with us, but we will talk more about different race, culture. I wanted to ask you that question before we start rolling. We were discussing the question about African American or Black. Would you consider yourself Black, or you consider yourself African American, or is that the difference for you?
Well, if you're talking to my parents, they would say Black. If you were talking to maybe a younger me, when I was in college, I would probably say African American. But now that I'm, older at a different state, I would say that I'm all of it. I'm global. You know, if someone says to me, well, how do you identify yourself? I could say either or. It doesn't make me feel uncomfortable, African American or Black. I know that for me, the first thing is that, first of all, I'm American. Because when I leave this country and I have that passport, they'll look at me, they'll say, we don't know if she's Black, we don't know if she's Haitian, we don't know if she's Spanish. But that passport says that I'm American. So I would say now, since I'm old and decrepit, I would say American first, Black and African American, because I'm representing a part of my history, the African side, of people, of a history of a people from another country, a continent. And then the American side, because my grandparents and great-grandparents were either brought over, born and raised here in America, that would make me the American part. But I want to just say one funny thing. Our president is truly an African American. His father was African and his mother was American. So, you know.
Wonderful. Dr. Maikel, your family Irish, you Irish, but you refuse to consider yourself white. Why?
Again, from the inside looking out, I don't notice that much of what I look like. Having had a foster child, Mark Marbury, who used to say as he grew up in the family before he was returned to his family, "Daddy, look at that black guy's looking at us as if we're strange." And I said, you know, it's not that we're strange. He's just getting used to the idea that I'm lucky enough to have a child like you. And so, again, I'm also sensitive historically because many, not directly, but also related folks who came over here as indentured servants came under the British. So I consider myself Celtic, not Anglo.
Interesting, interesting. On the last segment, we'll talk more about the Dr. King's speech. Please don't judge me by the color of my skin. Again, that's what we're going to talk. Does it really matter if I'm Black, if I'm African American, if I'm white? Does it really matter? That's all we'll talk about. Thank you so much. Stay with us.
So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
education and opportunity within reach. You're watching MDC-TV.
Dr. Martin Luther King, an American clergyman, activist, and prominent leader of the African American civil rights movement and Nobel Peace Prize laureate who became known for his advancement of civil rights by using civil disobedience, was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, an iconic moment in Tennessee. It was Thursday, April 4th, 1968, at the age of 39. 50 years later, what has changed? What are the perspectives of the white citizens of the United States, the African American citizens of the United States, the Hispanic citizens living here in the United States?
Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
Now we have a bigger panel to keep our discussion about Black History Month, where we're talking about civil rights movement, also other events that occurred during that time. Now, I want to talk about the Martin Luther King speech, I Have a Dream. Keith, you were 10 when Martin made the speech. What was that for you? What does that mean to you?
Well, I'll tell you, I had a great sense of pride to know that this man, who I actually had met, he was friendly with my my landlord and landladies at that time, and actually came to stay there while he was in Boston, one of his trips to Boston, and to hear him reverberate the things that my father always talked about, the equality, the chance for doing things that all Americans really wanted to do, and to have that opportunity, it brings back that sense of pride and the idea that we have the opportunity here in America that a lot of people in other countries at that point weren't able to have. We could speak about things, but there was still some guardedness and some trepidation about, is this really happening or is this real? It was a dream that I feel has still yet been realized. Mm-hmm. We have a long way yet to go.
Absolutely. I want, before I go with you, Dr. Maikel, I want to take our viewers to Dr. King's speech a little bit. Then we're going to react to that. I'll say joining us as well, Timothy, will talk about it. Let's take a look.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
I Have a Dream by Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. Maikel, you went to Selma recently. You saw the picture. What that telling you? Do we still have a long way to go for that dream?
Well, on the one hand, being present at the speech, I really didn't hear it. I was one of the many people trained in nonviolence to assure there hopefully would be no violence. Mm-hmm. But what was stuck with me was the point of judging people by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And for whatever reason, thinking in the training going up to that and after that, wow. On the other hand, reflecting, as Dr. King often did, on both the Old, but focusing predominantly on the New Testament, thinking of Keith's point, which I think is such an important point. And King would occasionally reflect on basically, old men will have dreams, young men will have visions. Mm-hmm. And so, retrospectively, looking back to that period where I actually at the time didn't completely pay attention because my role was something else in that huge area, but thinking his dream was planting the seeds for everyone, including myself and those present, to be pursuing a vision of something very different than we were inhibited by getting to that point in history.
So his dream for the new generation. We have Timothy from the new generation, if you want to call you that way. I Have a Dream by Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King obviously was inspired by Gandhi, peaceful movement, nonviolent. What's that telling you as a Irish Latino, if you want to call it?
Well, back as he said, older men have dreams, young men have visions. With that being said, our visions sometimes get corrupted by things we see. As I was listening to even J. Cole earlier today, and he said, could you really blame somebody for never really had things? And when I really thought about that, I mean, I've been robbed before like that. I had a guy who took my phone. He said, hey, can I use your phone? I was like, no problem, I get my phone. And then he looks at me and said, you just got jacked. And I was like, what? And he just rides off on his bike and takes my phone. And I had my camera on me at the time. It was about $700 and a backpack full of books. And I chased him down for the first block until I realized he's on a bike. I have a whole bunch of stuff on me. It doesn't matter if he's black, whatever. I'm not catching up to him no matter how I look at it. And I still have more on me than I could lose. I just lost $200. Whatever, I'll get a cheaper phone. It was just for my birthday. I was like, oh, just walk it off, you don't know. And then, you know, as a kid, I was really angry about that. It was a temporary point of time where I looked at black people. I was like, but at the same time, it's like you got to get over that. You can't just look at somebody.
So you were looking at African American or black people with the fear, like, oh,
but at that time,
they
I
after
went to
something.
North Miami Beach, so it was just dark-skinned people in general. Because no matter if African, Haitian, everything, there's so many different types that everyone was just look like. You just got angry anytime you saw someone because you thought of that moment.
Wow.
So you had resentment at seeing that, and you would figure you would correlate anytime you saw a dark person with somebody stealing your stuff. So what you have to do is break the bonds in between, comprehending that just because that person's dark-skinned doesn't mean that person. I mean, that's just like looking at anybody saying, oh, he must be a nice guy, he's white. Like, no, he could rob you right there too. Why would you think that?
Yeah. Dr. Maikel, when you moved to Miami, again, it's a mosaic of culture. You meet all the race, ethnicity. What was that for you, your experience in classroom with immigrants or white?
That was delicious because two of my favorite people, Dr. William Primus, whose sister I had worked with through a Black Nurses Association, and the College of the Hill in Atlanta, historically black colleges, and then someone who would become an influence in my own life, Dr. Morris Johnson. They were concerned that I was disconnected because I was working as a president of a foundation in the Midwest. And if you really believe everything you talk about, you got to come down here and join in what's next. And so my adjustment was preceded by the expectation of something extraordinary was going to happen. Spanish is my second language. Russian, which I can speak up at Aventura Mall, is my third language. And then the beautiful sounds of Creole and French. And a fellow faculty member, Cyril Francis, who, upon being one of the eulogists at his death, and I realized he was the foster parent for 65 children.
Wow.
And so the magnanimity, not just because people are wealthy or not just because they look like this, but their cultural roots and tenets combining to make it a community that I might not have imagined had I not been here, came together for me. And so as I sometimes, you know, when we see a corrupt official sometimes disappear, or we have a little problem or so on, I like to call up my relatives in Chicago and now spread across the country and say, guess what? I'm home. I'm never coming home. But in effect, this is the future, and it's too exciting to miss shaping the future here.
Yeah.
So I know we can have a bad day in Miami like we can anywhere on the planet, but a good day here is, I think, a good day shaping where a lot of the planet needs to go. Because in most countries where two folks don't look the same or believe the same or whatever, there's, you know, civil discord, genocide. And people forget Dr. King's travel after Memphis, where he was assassinated. He had tickets to go to visit Dom Helder Câmara in northeast Brazil, Olinda Recife, the so-called Red Archbishop of Brazil. And then he was to go on to visit with Mandela. And of course, those tickets never got used. But I mean, he wasn't done with the extent to which things could be perfected, knowing they were not perfect.
Yes.
But sharing what he could through himself to inspire a Mandela and a Dom Helder, both of whom, for whom he became change agents.
I want to go with you, Kit. You grew up in Boston, Now you're in Miami, but you dislike people calling you African American. Why you do not consider yourself an African American?
It's not that I don't consider myself an African American. I consider myself first an American. You know, we have many hats that we have to wear. In our identity, we have a lot of things that we label. I don't like to be labeled in any way, shape, or form, but I have a lot of labels that I have to wear. The first and foremost label that I wear is disabled.
Okay.
And so being disabled is a label that you see even before you might not even be able to see my face and tell that I'm black. But you see me in a wheelchair from a long distance away, and you see this guy on the wheelchair, and you have a certain identity that you attach to that. I want to try, in my lifetime, to erase all those labels and just allow me to be a human being. A human being that actually lives in America.
I like that. That's a good point of view. Timothy, your father is Irish. Your mother is Puerto Rican. How do you consider yourself?
Well, being raised in Miami, many different things, I guess. My father, he says he's Irish, but at being a fifth, maybe fourth to fifth generation, around the Great Famine time, came to America, has no family he knows of in Ireland or anything like that, and just has a few cousins in Jersey and across from Boston now. So he says, "Oh, I'm Irish." I said, "Well, you are a full-blooded ginger. I give you that." So I'd be like an African, like American saying, you know, I'm African. It's just like, why, because your skin color of Akon? I said, no, not really.
Yeah.
Just because you look like that. I mean, can you really call up somebody in Africa and say, hey, what's up? And said, well, why would you consider yourself that? But yet on my mom's side, she's a first generation American. Her parents both came from Puerto Rico. Dad died at a young age, and when that happened, she was half raised back in Puerto Rico with her family because she was raised in a foster home for a while until it was like, oh, I have family in Puerto Rico, and then they took her in and took her that. So I consider her not even like first generation American, like half Puerto Rican and half American at that point. So that would make me like half first generation, half second generation. And I have been to Puerto Rico, and I have cousins that I go over there and see. And it's weird because my aunt, she had, I believe, 2 different husbands, maybe 3, I'm not sure. I don't know the whole family history. I feel bad about that. So the oldest one is lighter than me with blue eyes and bald, so he has a lot of Spanish, like Spaniard in his bloodline, so that's why he looks so white. The second one has more Puerto Rican. She has green eyes, tanner skin, and everything. And the third one, her dad is Taiwanese Indian. He's the only uncle I actually met and know. And she's about just as dark as both of you.
Okay.
With straight hair.
From
and,
Puerto Rico.
Yeah, and I'd be like, that's my first cousin. And they're like, you got a black cousin? I said, she's not really black, she's Taino. And they just be like, what's Taino? It's like, it's native Puerto Rican Indian. And they're like,
yeah,
so
it will
she's
be a
black.
shocking moment.
I was like, so she's
At
black.
school
It's like,
in
no.
Miami, you had to sit in a classroom with immigrants, Haitian American or African American. What was that experience for you?
Well, from probably first grade, I was in Coconut Grove Elementary. Then I went to Little Carver. After that, I went to Doctors Charter School, and then Ponce de Leon, then North Miami Beach, and then Alonzo Tracy Morning Senior High. So I've gone through many different changes. I'm hoping maybe I'll go to a different college besides Miami-Dade, hopefully, like after I get the bachelor's, or maybe if I get a scholarship somewhere. But you never know where life takes you. But from being a Doctor's Charter, where the first few years were predominantly white, you know, it just felt normal, nothing different. Then after that, when I went to Ponce de Leon, there was half Hispanics and then half blacks. And since I was half Puerto Rican, the Hispanics, you know, treated me with them. And it was weird because it got almost to a gang feeling because the blacks wouldn't like the Hispanics. And it felt weird because I used to hang out with a lot of black kids in elementary school, and we wouldn't think of it like that. But when you saw the way everyone act, it was just, we don't mess with you, you don't mess with us, otherwise problems will happen. And to me, it was like, it felt a little weird because I still like playing basketball, I like playing soccer, but I can't play with the same group of people. If I play basketball, I play with the black kids. If I want to play soccer, I play with the Hispanic kids. And then I went to North Miami Beach Senior High, and then there was this new, like, groups, because in Coral Gables, it's blacks, like African Americans, and Islanders. And Islanders and African Americans usually get along pretty well. But in North Miami Beach, it was Haitians, and I didn't know what Creole was, I didn't know anything. And I just thought it was all the same until I heard the black people talking. I was like, what is he speaking? And then I'm like, it sounds like European or French and stuff like that, but I don't know it. And then I learned about the Jamaicans with patois, and it was like, if you listen real English, like, I swear I heard English in that. It was like, it's real fine English, but people think it's broken down. I said, no, when you actually listen to patois, it's actually much, much more complicated than English language because they use such powerful words that it's like, Wow. And like one someone said he's like, instead of a thief, he said extortionist. And I was like, only time I hear extortionist is when it's in a lawsuit and it's over another guy and like people talking really fine English. And like, you know, you could see a Jamaican from the hood and say that and just be like, most Americans don't even know that word. And here's a guy in like Jamaica's not really a third world country, but like, you know, where some places.
Know about that. But so would you say, Dr. Maikel, it's very interesting, his point of view, Timothy's point of view. So would you say being exposed to different culture, that is a plus to understand the differences that we have, and also as a professor here at Miami-Dade College, to help them grow, to accept each other, even though that we have differences?
Well, I mean, yeah, absolutely. On the one hand, you also begin to identify who you are in relationship to what you think is unusual, as you just gave a great illustration of, and you also gave. On the other hand, one of the arts that is not fully explored, and probably not even explained, is the art of inquiry among people who are different than you.
Yeah.
And instead of, whoa, what's that? When you see mango from the Dominican Republic, another approach might be, now there's an aroma I'm not familiar with. What do you have there? When I recently was doing projects in the southern Philippines, in Mindanao, there were these signs, no duraznos, which has a different meaning there than it does in Spanish, permitted in buses, planes, and so on. And I thought, oh my gosh, in the southern Philippines, they're discriminatory. You know, I thought that was over in most parts of the world. And so actually the proper name is durians. Durians are what they call the stinky fruit. And of course they don't want stinky fruit on the planes and the hotels and so on. But when you take away the cover, it is like a rich vanilla pudding and so on. So
you have to bring some here.
But again, if you went by the outside, or you went by, you know, what you thought everyone else's perception, you wouldn't know how to engage it. So I think the gift we give to each other, if we have the kind of little tools and techniques to share who we are, and then who others might be, is part of the gift we give to each other here.
Yeah, absolutely. We're running out of time, but we are celebrating Black History Month in February. So I wanted to ask you all that questions in a very 15 seconds. How do you see the civil rights movement from 1960s right now, 50 years later after Martin Luther King's speech? How do you see the future as, you know, as a white person, as a black, or as a Latino? How do you see the future now with technology, with all these things going on right now? How do you see the future for African Americans?
Within a more trustworthy law enforcement and adjudication process, I think it can evolve. And I think that is important. But again, it's something we have to work on every day. Yeah. And anyone's fallback is the fallback of all of us. And the only time I've ever spent in jail, 12 times, has never been for anything except civil disobedience for civil rights, bracero or Chicano rights, disability rights because of a daughter in my family who we learned so much from, and then women's rights. So I'll always tell my students, I hope the future doesn't include more jail time in advancing civil rights, because we can do that uncivilly or we can do that very civilly when the rest works.
Wonderful. Keith, talk to me.
Well, I see the future as being very, very bright. I think that the technology that we have has made us all globally aware. And because of that, things are changing in Cuba. They're changing all over the world because we are now a global community. So for my grandchildren and their children, I think things are going to be a lot better. I think that what's going to happen, or has to happen, is that the old ways have to die. And that means those people that are running those old ways and continue to perpetuate the old ways have to leave in order for there to really to be true progress.
Wonderful, wonderful. Timothy, it's I have to say first, we are very proud of you to be a student at Miami-Dade College. The future, what do you see?
Well, really into what you said earlier, saying when you said progression of what we see as Martin Luther King's dream and saying how far are we away from that. in all honesty, there should be no way to measure that. As he said earlier, saying things that we're doing right now, as the Embargo Act that's been over for 50 years, it just ended now, we can finally do that. We can end this right now and just all be friends if we would just open our minds enough, because when people see things, we don't see things in a box, we don't see them as open. And I think that if you're as flexible as you are physically, like once I learned how to do yoga, mentally I started thinking of so many different things, because I started learning so many different people's ways and stuff, that you just start seeing things totally different way in a perspective rather than a stiff mentality that's been wrong for so many years. So the progression shouldn't be measured as a matter of time, but as a matter of change, saying, oh, it's going to take a long time in the court systems to get this change, rather if we just did it today, like Obama's been doing with a lot of things, we can get so many things done so quick. A lot of bad reactions on some people, but only time can tell.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, gentlemen. I have to say, Dr. Maikel, professor here at Miami-Dade College. Keith, former MDC students, very proud of you. And Timothy, current student. It's very interesting to have, different point of views from all of you living in the same country and now in the same city, Miami. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you as well as to you for watching. My name is James Pierre. We'll see you next time.
Mm-hmm.